Imagine you are a young woman in Germany in the late 1930s. You are unmarried, you are pregnant, and you are terrified. Not because of the war hasn't started yet, but because of the shame. Single motherhood in 1930s Germany was a social death sentence. Your family, your neighbors, your employer, they would all know. The whispers would follow you for the rest of your life, and they would follow your child even longer. Now imagine a man in a black uniform knocks on your door and tells you that the state wants to help, that your child, your unborn baby, is not a problem to be hidden, but a treasure to be celebrated, that there is a beautiful home waiting for you in the countryside, with doctors and nurses and fresh food and clean air, where you can give birth in peace and comfort, far from judging eyes. He tells you that your child will be a gift to the German nation, that you are not a sinner, you are a hero. All you have to do is pass a medical examination. All you have to do is prove that your blood is pure. Welcome to the Lebensborn program.
Today, we are going to explore one of the most chilling, strange, and deeply disturbing corners of the Second World War, a program that tried to manufacture human beings on an industrial scale, not through violence or terror, at least not at first, but through biology, through breeding, through the cold clinical logic of a state that had decided it could engineer the future of the human race. This is the story of the Lebensborn, which translates from German as fount of life, and the story of what happened when a regime with the resources of an empire decided to play God. The dream of engineering humanity. To understand Lebensborn, you first need to understand the world that produced it, and the man at the center of it all. Heinrich Himmler is one of those figures from the Second World War who is almost impossible to fully wrap your head around. On the surface, he was deeply ordinary, short, stocky, round-faced, perpetually wearing round-framed glasses that gave him the look of a provincial schoolteacher or a particularly humorless bank clerk. He was born in Munich in 1900 to a pious Catholic family.
He studied agriculture at the Technical University. For a brief time, he sold fertilizer for a living. And yet this deeply unremarkable man would go on to become the architect of one of the most murderous organizations in human history, and would personally oversee a program designed to reshape the biological future of the entire German people. Himmler's obsession with racial purity was all-consuming, almost religious in its intensity. He had read widely in the pseudo-scientific literature of race theory that had been circulating in Germany and across the broader Western world since the late 1800s, a body of ideas built on the misappropriated framework of evolutionary biology, filtered through aggressive nationalism and dressed up in the language of science. The core premise was devastatingly simple. Human beings could be improved through selective breeding, just like livestock or crops. You could breed out weakness, criminality, illness, and racial impurity. You could breed in strength, intelligence, loyalty, and what these theorists called racial value. By the time Himmler took control of the SS in 1929, this ideology had already been baked into his worldview for years. The SS itself, from its earliest days under Himmler's command, was conceived of not merely as a police force or a military unit, but as a biological experiment, a racial elite. Every man who wanted to join had to submit detailed genealogical records proving his ancestry going back generations, undergo a full medical examination, and present photographs of himself and his intended bride for racial inspection. If the examiners found fault with the woman's racial profile, Himmler would personally deny permission for the marriage to proceed. His approach, as he once described it to his officers, was that of a nursery gardener trying to reproduce a good old strain that had been diluted and weakened, weeding out what was unwanted, selecting for what was desirable, applying to human beings the same logic you would apply to a field of wheat. But there was a problem. Germany's birth rate had been falling for decades. Between 1915 and 1933, there were 14 million fewer births in Germany than there had been in the comparable period from 1896 to 1914. The country was hemorrhaging people, and in Himmler's view, it was hemorrhaging the right kind of people, the racially valuable ones, the tall blonde SS men and the strong German women who ought to have been filling the Reich with children, but were instead having fewer of them, or in some cases, none at all. He estimated that at least 100,000 pregnancies among women he would have classified as biologically valuable were being terminated illegally every year. This was, to Himmler, a catastrophe, not a moral one, not in the ordinary sense, a strategic one. If Germany was going to conquer and colonize the vast territories of Eastern Europe, it was going to need people, millions of them. Specifically, it needed the right kind of people, and if those people weren't being born fast enough, something would have to be done about it. On December 12, 1935, the Lebensborn organization was formally registered, a quiet, bureaucratic act that would have consequences stretching across decades and across an entire continent.
The science that wasn't: eugenics and racial ideology. Before we go further, it is worth pausing to understand the ideological machinery that made Lebensborn possible. Because the program didn't spring from nowhere, it was the logical endpoint of a body of ideas that had been growing for over half a century and that had found enthusiastic audiences not just in Germany, but across the industrialized world. The word eugenics was coined in 1883 by Francis Galton, a British scientist and a cousin of Charles Darwin. The basic idea was that human heredity followed predictable patterns, and that just as breeders could improve the qualities of animals through careful selection, societies could improve the qualities of their populations the same way, by encouraging reproduction among the fit and discouraging or preventing it among the unfit. It sounded rational, it sounded like science, and in the early decades of the 20th century, it attracted serious, credentialed scientists, doctors, politicians, and public health officials across Europe, North America, and beyond. By the 1920s, sterilization laws had been passed in 24 American states. Tens of thousands of people deemed mentally deficient or otherwise undesirable were forcibly sterilized in the United States before a single Nazi had come to power in Germany. The Nazis knew this. They admired it. American eugenicist Harry Laughlin openly bragged that his model sterilization laws had served as a template for Germany's own 1935 Nuremberg racial hygiene legislation and was even awarded an honorary doctorate by Heidelberg University in recognition of his contribution. The crucial difference, of course, was what happened when you took this pseudoscience and handed it to a totalitarian state with an army, a secret police force, and the will to act without constraint. In Germany, after 1933, eugenics wasn't a debate in academic journals or a contested legislative proposal. It was state policy, implemented with German thoroughness and German efficiency. The 1933 law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases mandated the forced sterilization of hundreds of thousands of Germans deemed to be hereditarily ill, a category that included the mentally ill, the physically disabled, epileptics, alcoholics, and a range of others. Approximately 400,000 Germans were ultimately sterilized under this law. Roughly 5,000 people died as a direct result of the procedures. That was the negative side of Nazi eugenics, eliminating the undesirable. But there was a positive side too, which is where Lebensborn came in. If you were going to thin the herd, you also had to build it back up. You had to encourage the right people to reproduce more, and you had to make sure their offspring were healthy, numerous, and thoroughly indoctrinated from birth. This was the world into which the Lebensborn was born, not as a fringe experiment by a few fanatics, but as a logical extension of mainstream policy that had been implemented by doctors, professors, legal scholars, and scientists who were at the top of their professions, working within a system that had removed all the usual moral and institutional constraints on their work.
Inside the homes, how the program actually worked. The first Lebensborn home, called Heim Hochland, opened on August 15, 1936, in Steinhöring, a small village not far from Munich in the Bavarian countryside. It was established in a confiscated property, and like many that would follow, it was set up in a large, comfortable house that had been requisitioned for the purpose. Many of the later facilities across Germany and Austria were also established in confiscated homes and former nursing facilities that had previously belonged to Jewish families. To be admitted, a woman had to meet a strict and detailed set of criteria. She had to submit her full personal medical history, she had to document her family history going back multiple generations, searching for any evidence of physical illness, mental illness, psychiatric disability, criminal history, or what the Nazis classified as hereditary weakness of any kind. Only 40% of the women who applied were ultimately accepted. The father of the child had to meet similar criteria, and his background was investigated with equal rigor. If you passed, the experience was, in material terms, surprisingly comfortable. The homes were well equipped by the standards of the time. Mothers received proper prenatal care, medically supervised deliveries, and what was described as a more than adequate diet, a significant benefit in a country where food was increasingly rationed as the war years wore on. The babies born in these homes were famously healthy. After the war ended and Allied forces discovered some of these facilities, reporters noted with surprise the unusually good weight and physical condition of the children. The babies received 2 baths a day. Everything that came into contact with them was disinfected. Nurses ensured they ate properly and spent time outdoors in sunlight. Until the very last days of the war, mothers and children in these homes received the best of what was available, even as ordinary German families outside were going hungry. But the warmth of the environment was deceptive. The ideological apparatus was all-pervasive. Women who entered the homes had to pledge their loyalty to National Socialist ideology. They were indoctrinated throughout their pregnancy. Births were not registered through the normal civil registry offices. Instead, they were covered by a special SS certificate confirming the child's racial purity. Photographs of the babies were strictly forbidden. The program operated under tight secrecy, and it was considered absolutely essential that details about who was breeding with whom did not become public knowledge. Doctors who worked in the homes swore an SS oath of silence. For the babies born to unmarried women, and roughly 60% of Lebensborn births were to unmarried mothers, the situation was particularly fraught. The organization served as a kind of shadow adoption agency. If the mother chose to keep her child, she could, provided she was deemed capable of raising it in accordance with Nazi values. If she gave the child up, or if the Lebensborn Central Office decided that she could not adequately raise it, the child was placed with adoptive parents, drawn primarily from the SS and its associated families. The birth father was frequently a married SS officer. The organization explicitly encouraged SS men to father children outside their marriages, and Himmler made no secret of this, viewing it as a patriotic duty rather than a moral failing. The SS christening ceremony for Lebensborn children was designed to replace the Christian baptism entirely. The infant was cradled beneath a symbolic SS dagger, while attendants muttered oaths pledging the child's lifelong loyalty to Nazi ideology. In return, the program promised that these children and their mothers would want for nothing: the finest food, comfortable homes, quality clothing, all supplied to ensure that the next generation of what Himmler envisioned as the Nazi elite would grow up accustomed to the fruits of conquest. By 1939, before the war had even begun in earnest, Lebensborn had around 8,000 members in Germany, of whom 3,500 were SS leaders. In total, between 1936 and 1945, approximately 7,000 to 8,000 children were born in the Lebensborn maternity homes inside Germany and Austria. It was, by any reasonable measure, a startling failure relative to Himmler's ambitions. He had hoped to reverse Germany's declining birth rate and flood the Reich with racially valuable children. Instead, he had produced roughly the same number of babies in 9 years that a moderately sized German city might produce in a single year. So he looked elsewhere, expanding the bloodline: Norway and the occupied territories. When German forces occupied Norway in April 1940, Himmler saw an opportunity that, in his view, was almost too good to be true. Norwegian women in the racial taxonomy of Nazi ideology were considered to be among the most desirable on the planet. The Nordic gene, blonde hair, blue eyes, tall, fair-skinned, was precisely what the SS had been trying to cultivate. Norway was, in Himmler's pseudoscientific thinking, a reservoir of exactly the racial material Germany needed. He actively encouraged German soldiers and officers stationed in Norway to pursue relationships with local women. The Nazi puppet government under Vidkun Quisling even changed Norwegian law to allow minor girls to marry German soldiers without parental permission. 9 Lebensborn homes were eventually established in Norway. Over the course of the 5-year German occupation, somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 children were born in these facilities. More Lebensborn children born in Norway during 5 years of occupation than were born in Germany across the entire 10-year span of the program inside the Reich itself. This was the program working exactly as Himmler had intended. The wombs of Scandinavian women, in the cold bureaucratic language of SS racial policy, were to be put to use in expanding Germany's biological reserves. The homes also spread to France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Denmark. In the Netherlands, racially acceptable women could only be admitted if the father was a confirmed SS member. Several hundred children were born through the Dutch program. Across all of these locations, the pattern was the same. The women received good care, the births were kept secret, and the children were typically placed with German adoptive families shortly after birth. In Norway, many of these mothers were not informed that their children were going to be sent to Germany. They were told only that an adoption was being arranged, not that the child would be raised by strangers in a foreign country. The consequences for these women and children after the war ended were in many cases devastating. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, local communities across occupied Europe turned on the women who had slept with German men and given birth to German children. In Norway, women who had been in relationships with German soldiers, the so-called Tyskerjenter or German girls, were beaten, had their heads shaved, and were driven out of their communities. Their children were called derogatory names, excluded from schools, abused by their classmates, placed in mental institutions, and in some cases, subjected to formal government attempts to have them deported to Germany, Australia, or Brazil, attempts that ultimately failed. The Norwegian government recovered only 170 of the approximately 250 Lebensborn children who had been adopted through the organization's Norwegian branch. The rest had already been absorbed into Germany, their identities rewritten. Inside Germany, the children born in the homes who had been adopted by SS families and raised under false identities often did not learn the truth about their origins for decades. Some never did. Their birth certificates had been falsified. Their biological fathers, frequently married SS officers, were not listed. The program's secrecy was so thorough and the destruction of its records at the end of the war so complete that for many of these children, the questions of who they were and where they came from simply had no answers. The darker turn, kidnapping and Germanization. Everything described so far, the maternity homes, the selective breeding, the SS christenings, was the relatively clean version of the Lebensborn program, the version that, horrifying as it was, at least operated on the principle of consent, at least in its early stages. Beginning in 1939, as German armies swept across Poland and then across the rest of Europe, the program developed a far darker dimension. The problem, as Himmler saw it, was a paradox. When German forces marched into Poland in September 1939, the soldiers were confronted with something that made no sense within their ideological framework: thousands upon thousands of Polish children with blonde hair and blue eyes. Polish children who, by the visual standards of Nazi racial theory, looked more Aryan than many Germans. How is this possible? Poland was supposed to be a nation of racial inferiors, subhumans, in the language of Nazi ideology, fit only for slave labor and eventual elimination. And yet here were all these children who looked exactly like the ideal German. Himmler's answer was characteristic in its audacity. These children, he decided, were not really Polish at all. They must be the descendants of German settlers who had migrated into Polish territory over previous centuries, and whose blood had somehow remained pure despite generations of living among Slavic people. They were lost Germans. They needed to be recovered. In February 1942, SS General Ulrich Greifeld issued Directive 67-1 from Himmler's office.
Polish children with suitable physical characteristics were to be identified and taken from their parents under the cover story that their health was at risk and they were being sent away for treatment. These children were to be transported to collection centers, officially called children's education camps or Kindererziehungslager, in Lodz or Kalisz, where they would undergo a comprehensive racial examination. The examination was extraordinarily detailed. 62 separate physical characteristics were assessed: eye color, hair color, the distance between the forehead and the back of the skull, the shape of the nose, the thickness of the lips, posture, the proportions of the body. For girls, even the size of the pelvis was measured, assessed for reproductive viability. Based on the results, children were sorted into one of three categories: desired population growth, meaning they were considered suitable for Germanization; acceptable population growth, meaning they might be usable with work; and undesired population growth, meaning they had failed. The consequences of failure were stark.
Children classified as undesired were often sent to concentration camps, predominantly to Kalisz in Poland, or were simply euthanized on the spot and had their death certificates falsified to show pneumonia as the cause. Children who passed and were between the ages of 2 and 6 were sent to Lebensborn homes in Germany, where they were placed with SS families for adoption. Children between 6 and 12 were placed in state boarding schools, where the process of Germanization began. And that process was designed to be total and irreversible. From the moment a kidnapped Polish child entered a Lebensborn home or a German boarding school, the systematic erasure of their identity began. Their Polish names were replaced with German ones. Their birth certificates were destroyed and replaced with falsified German documents. They were forbidden, under threat of severe punishment, to speak Polish, to maintain contact with their families, or to express any aspect of their Polish identity.
SS nurses and teachers told the children that their real parents had been shameful people, prostitutes, alcoholics, criminals, who had deliberately abandoned them.
They were told they should be grateful to have been rescued. Children who refused to cooperate, who persisted in speaking their native language, who seemed un-German in their behavior or attitudes, were beaten. Those who continued to resist were sent to Auschwitz. The story of Aloisi Twardetsky captures this process with heartbreaking specificity. In the summer of 1943, his mother, Malgorzata, a single parent living in occupied Poland, received an official order to bring her 5-year-old son to the local council office the following morning. He was to go on a health holiday. The boy had blonde hair and blue eyes. When his mother refused, military police arrived at the door and took Aloisi by force. She watched him board a train without being told where he was going. He was renamed Alfred Hartmann. He was adopted by a German family in Koblenz. His adoptive grandfather told him the Poles had started the war. When the Polish Red Cross eventually located him in 1954, 9 years after the war ended, he could not speak Polish. He was unable to believe what he was told about the country and the family from which he had been taken. The propaganda had worked completely. Estimates of the total number of children abducted across occupied Europe vary considerably, largely because the SS destroyed virtually all of their records as Allied forces advanced. Poland alone may have lost somewhere between 20,000 and 200,000 children to this process. The wide range reflects the difficulty of counting acts that were carefully designed to be uncountable. A broader estimate for all of occupied Europe suggests as many as 300,000 children in total. By mistake, around 200 children were also abducted from Romania, which was at the time a German ally, a bureaucratic error that illustrates the chaotic and indiscriminate nature of the operation at ground level. After the war, only about 25,000 of the abducted Polish children were located and returned. Of those identified as kidnapped, somewhere between 10 and 15% ever made it back to their families or to Poland at all. Many had already been fully assimilated into German society. Some returned to families who were strangers to them, speaking no Polish, with no memory of the life they had been taken from. Some of the German families who had received these children actively refused to give them back, having raised them for years as their own. In a number of documented cases, the children themselves refused to go. They had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they could not accept or did not believe the truth of their origins. The Reckoning: Trials, Records, and the Long Shadow. As Allied armies close in on Germany from the east and west in the spring of 1945, the SS set about destroying the evidence of what they had done. The Lebensborn organization maintained a central archive at its headquarters in Munich, along with records at each of the individual homes scattered across Germany and occupied Europe. As the end approached, SS personnel systematically burned, shredded, and destroyed as much of this documentation as they could. When the first Lebensborn home at Steinhering in Bavaria was evacuated, the SS took with them all the food, all the valuables, including paintings, and all the records they could carry. They left behind around 300 children and a number of pregnant and recently delivered women. Some of the 3- and 4-year-olds were found unable to speak and showing clear signs of developmental delay and neglect. Around 15% of them showed signs of severe cognitive disability. Children who, in the language of the program that had created them, would have been sent away to be killed had Germany not been collapsing around their ears. The destruction of records meant that the full extent of the program would never be precisely known. How many children had passed through the homes? How many had been kidnapped and Germanized? How many had been killed because they failed the racial examinations? The answers to these questions were buried in the ash and smoke of burning files, carried away in the memories of SS men who fled, and who in many cases would live out their lives in comfortable obscurity in post-war Germany, or in some cases in South America. The question of legal accountability was addressed partially at the Nuremberg trials. The 8th of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, known as the RuSHA trial, formally titled United States of America versus Ulrich Greifeld et al., put 14 officials of the Race and Settlement Main Office and the Lebensborn organization on trial for crimes against humanity between 1947 and 1948. The charges included kidnapping children for Germanization, forcing abortions on Eastern European women, deporting populations, and persecuting Jews. The verdicts were mixed and, for many survivors, deeply unsatisfying. 13 of the 14 defendants were found guilty of something. Ulrich Greifeld, who headed the overall Germanization program, was sentenced to life imprisonment, though he died in prison in 1949 before his sentence could be fully carried out. Richard Hildebrand was eventually handed over to Polish authorities, convicted of atrocities committed in Poland and executed in 1951. However, the 4 defendants who were specifically connected to the Lebensborn organization itself, including Max Salman, the managing director, were acquitted on the counts relating to kidnapping.
The court's reasoning was careful. While there was overwhelming evidence that tens of thousands of children had been kidnapped across occupied Europe, the court concluded that the Lebensborn organization as such had only been directly connected to a relatively small number of these cases. The wider machinery of abduction had been operated by other SS organizations, the Race and Settlement Main Office, the Volksdeutsche Mittelstelle, and other agencies, and Lebensborn had functioned primarily as a receiving and processing organization, not as the initiating force. Of approximately 10,000 foreign-born children located in the American-controlled zone of Germany after the war, only 340 had been directly handled by Lebensborn as an organization. This legal distinction, while technically defensible, felt to many observers like an exercise in bureaucratic hair-splitting. The fact that the actual kidnapping had been carried out by agencies other than Lebensborn did not alter the reality that the children had still ended up in Lebensborn homes, been given German names by Lebensborn staff, and been placed with German families through the Lebensborn adoption network. The kidnapping had been part of the same broader Germanization policy that Lebensborn served. The distinction between the organizations that grabbed the children and the organization that processed them felt to the parents whose children had been taken like a distinction without a moral difference. The Nuremberg trials later ruled that the overall program of kidnapping, Germanization, and extermination of children who failed the racial examinations constituted genocide, one of the earliest formal applications of that concept following its coinage in 1944. For the children themselves, the end of the war brought no neat resolution. Those born in the homes inside Germany came of age knowing nothing of their origins, with falsified birth certificates and absent fathers whose identities had been deliberately concealed. Many spent decades not knowing whether their parents were alive, who their fathers were, or what had happened to them. The discovery of the truth, when it came, was frequently traumatic. One survivor, named Guntram Weber, speaking decades later, described learning that his father had not died heroically on the battlefield as his mother had always told him, but had instead been a high-ranking SS officer who had died peacefully in Argentina after the war, surrounded by former comrades. Weber's voice, as he told the story, was thick with anger and grief. Another survivor, Gisela Heidenreich, a family therapist from Bavaria, became the first of the Lebensborn children to publicly write about her experience. Born in a Lebensborn home in Oslo, her German parents had chosen to use a facility there specifically to keep the birth as far from their home community as possible. She spent years piecing together who she was and how she had come to exist. She drew, in her later years, the uncomfortable parallel between the Lebensborn program and the modern science of genetic selection. With advances in genetics, she observed, discriminating parents might soon be able to select traits in their unborn children. Given that possibility, she felt, the evils of what had been attempted in the Nazi era had to remain visible and understood, not allowed to fade into historical abstraction. The Norwegian children and their mothers faced specific and lasting trauma. For decades after the war, the surviving Lebensborn children of Norway, the sons and daughters of Norwegian women and German soldiers, were targets of abuse, social exclusion, and institutional persecution. Some were placed in mental institutions, not because they were mentally ill, but because of who their fathers had been. It was not until the late 1990s and 2000s that the Norwegian government formally acknowledged the mistreatment these individuals had suffered and began to address it through compensation and official apology. The kidnapped children of Poland and Eastern Europe carried perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Many lived their entire lives never knowing they had been taken. In Germany today, it is believed that hundreds of thousands of people may be descended from children kidnapped during the occupation, people who have no idea their family name, their nationality, their entire sense of who they are was assigned to them by an SS clerk in a processing camp somewhere in Poland or Yugoslavia 80 years ago. The Lebensborn program was, in the end, a failure.
It failed on its own terms. It did not produce the tidal wave of racially pure children that Himmler had envisioned. It did not reverse Germany's declining birth rate. It did not create a biological master race. The approximately 7,000 children born in the homes in Germany and the perhaps 25,000 born across occupied Europe were a fraction of what the program's architects had imagined. The 1,000-year Reich that these children were supposed to populate and lead lasted 12 years. The ideology that produced them was discredited, defeated, and buried. But the program's legacy cannot be measured only in failure.
It also produced a generation of people whose identities were stolen, whose families were destroyed, whose names were changed, and whose origins were deliberately hidden from them. It produced the abduction of somewhere between 20,000 and 200,000 Polish children alone. Children who were torn from their parents at train stations and in town squares, sorted by the color of their eyes and the shape of their skulls, and distributed into German families as if they were livestock. Most of them never went home. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. This wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't a concentration camp. This was a program run by doctors and lawyers and social workers, operating out of comfortable country houses, filling out careful paperwork, following procedures and protocols, all in the service of an idea so obviously wrong that even articulating it today feels almost absurd. The idea that human beings could be graded like produce, that the depth of a child's worth could be measured in the distance between their forehead and the back of their skull. History keeps teaching this lesson, and somehow it keeps needing to be taught again. The machinery of organized evil rarely looks the way we expect it to look. It often doesn't wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wears a white coat, or carries a clipboard, or knocks politely on a door and offers to help. If you found this story valuable, I'd be grateful if you took a moment to leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are curious about these corners of history. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We cover the Second World War in depth, from the largest campaigns to the smallest and strangest stories that rarely make it into the textbooks. There is plenty more to come, and I'll see you in the next one.